Vanishing First Nations, the world's most endangered indigenous peoples. Before borders, before flags, before passports and constitutions, there were nations, not nations born of conquest or treaties signed at gunpoint, but nations rooted in land, language, memory, and living law. They governed themselves long before governance became a textbook word. Today, many of those nations stand at the edge of disappearance. This is not ancient history. This is not a distant tragedy buried in museums. This is happening now, in real time, within a single human lifetime. Across the Americas, Australia, Africa, Asia, and Europe, indigenous peoples, the world's First Nations, are vanishing. Not by accident, not by fate, but through deliberate policies, extractive projects, demographic engineering, cultural erasure, and economic systems that treat indigenous survival as an obstacle to development. This is the story of the most endangered native nations on Earth, and it is also a mirror held up to the modern world. What endangered really means. When a people is called endangered, it does not only mean low population numbers. It means languages with no children left to speak them. It means elders carrying entire civilizations in their memories, with no one left to inherit them. It means lands taken without consent, renamed, fenced, mined, flooded, or militarized. It means sacred sites turned into tourist attractions or industrial zones. It means cultures criminalized, rituals banned, and identities reduced to folklore. It means food systems destroyed and replaced with dependency. It means children educated out of their own history. It means resistance punished, leaders jailed, and survival reframed as rebellion. According to UNESCO, nearly half of the world's roughly 7,000 languages may disappear by the end of this century, most of them indigenous. This is not linguistic trivia. This is mass extinction at the level of human knowledge. When a language dies, a way of understanding reality dies with it. A unique science of land, climate, medicine, and coexistence is erased. A worldview refined over thousands of years vanishes, often without a record, often without witnesses. What disappears is not only people. What disappears is a future the world never allowed itself to learn from. Across the globe, each region tells a story of survival and erasure. Different peoples, similar struggles. North America, conditional citizenship and cultural suppression. Indigenous communities in the U.S. and Canada suffer land loss, federal restrictions, cultural suppression, and language erosion. Legal recognition exists, but enforcement is inconsistent. Historical trauma remains deeply structural. Let's look at each separately. First, United States, surviving after genocide. In the United States, indigenous nations survived genocide, but survival came at a cost that still compounds today. Removal, forced marches, massacres, boarding schools, and land seizures were not side effects of history. They were deliberate policy, designed to erase people, languages, and governance systems. The Yuchi, also known as the Yuchi, once lived across the southeastern United States as a distinct nation with its own law, ceremonies, and cosmology. Today, their language, unrelated to any other on Earth, has only a handful of fluent speakers left. When a language isolate disappears, it takes with it an entire branch of human thought, a worldview encoded in words, songs, and rituals that cannot be translated. Across the United States, other indigenous languages are similarly endangered. Navajo, Diné Bizad, once spoken by hundreds of thousands, now sees declining intergenerational transmission outside reservation schools. Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota languages of the Sioux Nation are spoken fluently by only a few thousand elders. Eastern woodland languages like Mohawk, Oneida, and Cree face critical decline, with revitalization efforts struggling against decades of suppression. Hopi, Zuni, and Choctaw languages continue to survive, but with shrinking communities of native speakers. In California, the Karuk and Tolowa Dini nations face another threat: ecological collapse. Dams, mining, and logging destroyed salmon rivers, the backbone of their culture, economy, and legal order. When the salmon disappear, governance systems tied to seasonal cycles collapse, and ceremonial life is disrupted. Federal recognition exists for many tribes, but recognition without land, water rights, resources, or meaningful jurisdiction is survival on paper only. Even federally recognized tribes face obstacles to exercising authority, enforcing treaty rights, and protecting sacred sites. From the Dakota Access Pipeline protests to struggles over healthcare, education, and language revitalization programs, survival in the United States is continuous, contested, and fragile. Second is Canada. Recognition of Indigenous peoples without repair. Canada officially recognizes Indigenous rights and promotes itself as a global leader in reconciliation. Yet many First Nations live under conditions that would be unacceptable anywhere else in the country. Decades of colonization, residential schools, and forced assimilation have left deep scars on communities. Entire indigenous communities lack clean drinking water for decades at a time. Youth suicide rates in some First Nations are 5 to 10 times the national average, an epidemic of despair rooted in dispossession, not culture. The Beothuk people of Newfoundland were declared extinct in the 19th century, a complete erasure following violence, disease, and starvation. Others, like the Haida, fight to save languages with only a few elder speakers remaining, racing against time itself. Across Canada, Indigenous languages face similar threats. Cree, across multiple provinces, is losing fluent speakers as younger generations shift toward English or French. Inuktitut, vital to Inuit culture, faces pressures from English and French dominance in schools, media, and government. Mohawk, Ojibwe, Dene, and Mi'kmaq communities struggle to maintain intergenerational language transmission. Despite immersion programs and digital preservation efforts, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions documented the harm. But reconciliation without land return, resource control, and political power leaves the structure of harm intact. Acknowledgement without repair becomes another form of delay, a system that commemorates loss without empowering the living. Across Canada, survival is ongoing, contested, and bound to both cultural and political struggles. Latin America. Latin America. Silenced origins. Latin America is one of the deadliest regions in the world to be Indigenous. Here, identity itself can be a death sentence. Indigenous peoples face displacement, environmental dispossession, criminalization of traditional practices, and marginalization of languages, especially in the Amazon, Andes, and Central America. Historical genocide compounds ongoing structural exclusion. In Brazil, the Awa people, some of whom remain uncontacted, are often described as the most endangered people on Earth. Illegal loggers, settlers, and even organized criminal groups invade their land, sometimes violently. Despite constitutional protections that exist only on paper, forests are destroyed, villages abandoned, and sacred spaces violated. The Yanomami face mercury poisoning from illegal gold mining. Children die from diseases brought by outsiders. Rivers become toxic, and forests turn into extraction zones guarded by guns and impunity. Several indigenous languages in Latin America are facing severe endangerment. Ticuna, in the Amazon, is declining as Portuguese dominates schools and media. Quechua, once the lingua franca of the Inca Empire, survives but is increasingly overshadowed by Spanish. Guarani, Aymara, Nahuatl, and Mapudungun struggle to survive as national policies favor Spanish and Portuguese in public life, legal systems, and education. Smaller languages in the Amazon are threatened with complete extinction due to displacement, disease, and assimilation. In Honduras, the Lenca defend rivers against dams, mining, and extractive projects. For that defense, leaders are threatened, imprisoned, or killed. Environmental protection, necessary for survival, is criminalized as opposition. Here, endangerment is immediate, armed, and fatal. Survival requires constant vigilance, legal battles, and international advocacy. Australia. Culture without speakers. In Australia, Indigenous endangerment is quieter, but no less severe. It unfolds through silence, erasure, and legal indifference. Colonial policies forcibly removed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families for generations. The result was not only trauma but catastrophic collapse of languages and culture. Many Aboriginal languages today have fewer than 10 speakers. Some have only one. Languages such as Wiradjuri, Kaurna, Adnyamathanha, Yolngumatha, and Warlpiri teeter on the brink of extinction. Their survival relies on elders, documentation, immersion programs, and digital preservation. Sacred sites were destroyed with legal approval. In 2020, a mining company destroyed Jukan Gorge, a site over 46,000 years old, legally sanctioned, but culturally devastating. Countless other sites, from ceremonial grounds to burial places, have been leveled for infrastructure, agriculture, or urban expansion. Language loss compounds loss of law, ceremony, and ecological knowledge. When a language dies, so too does a unique understanding of land, seasonal cycles, and coexistence refined over millennia. Revitalization efforts exist, including community schools, media programs, and university partnerships. Yet survival is not guaranteed. Government recognition and funding remain inconsistent, and structural barriers in law and bureaucracy limit implementation. Endangerment in Australia is structural, legalized, and bureaucratic, ensuring that physical survival does not automatically mean cultural flourishing. Even cultural expressions such as storytelling, songlines, and ceremonial dance are vulnerable, surviving only in fragmented, mediated forms. Africa. Erasure without headlines. Outside the Western spotlight, indigenous endangerment in Africa unfolds quietly, often disguised as conservation, development, or national unity. It rarely makes global news, yet it is relentless, structural, and enduring. In southern Africa, the San, among the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, have been evicted from ancestral lands in Botswana, Namibia, and beyond. Traditional hunting practices were criminalized in the name of wildlife protection. Tourism thrived. Autonomy vanished. Dependency replaced self-sufficiency. Conservation zones became borders. Rangers became enforcers. People older than the state were told they no longer belonged on their own land. In Namibia, the Himba people face similar pressures. Their semi-nomadic pastoralist lifestyle is constrained by land privatization, mining concessions, and water restrictions, while government policies prioritize commercial development over traditional rights. In East Africa, pastoralists and forest peoples face parallel erasure. In Kenya, the Ogiek won landmark, court rulings affirming their collective land rights in the Mau forest. Yet evictions continue, often framed as environmental protection rather than dispossession. Legal victory without enforcement becomes symbolic survival. In Ethiopia, the Tulama, Raya, Wolo, Karayu, Guji, Borana, and other agriculturalist and pastoralist Oromo groups contend with land grabbing, state-led resettlement, and military interventions that undermine centuries-old, customary governance and grazing systems. Across the Horn, the Afar people experience similar pressures in the Afar Triangle, where mining and infrastructure projects threaten ancestral lands. Aju, Kemant, and many other peoples in Ethiopia face extensive pressures. Across Africa, erasure also works through language. Slowly, bureaucratically, and with lasting effect. European colonial languages, English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and Italian, replaced indigenous African languages as the languages of power. They became the languages of courts, schools, administration, and modern citizenship. Indigenous languages were pushed into the private sphere, labeled backward, informal, or unfit for governance. A child can be punished in school for speaking their mother tongue. A citizen can be excluded from justice for not speaking a colonial language. Language carries law. Law carries authority. Authority reshapes identity. Across Africa, major indigenous languages with millions of speakers have been systematically marginalized. Afan Oromo, spoken by more than 40 million people in the state of Oromia and beyond in Ethiopia, has long been sidelined despite its demographic weight. Berber, Tamazight languages across North Africa were suppressed for generations in favor of Arabic and French. Wolof, Fulfulde, Fulani, Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba, Shona, Zulu, Xhosa, and other indigenous languages spoken by vast communities are often absent from national courts, higher education, and central governance. In Morocco and Algeria, Amazigh communities have struggled for decades to have Tamazight officially recognized, only recently achieving partial recognition, while daily bureaucratic use remains limited. Customary legal systems refined over centuries were displaced by foreign codes, written in foreign tongues. To speak one's language became to stand outside the state. To survive within it often required abandoning it or translating oneself into something more acceptable. In Central Africa, indigenous forest peoples such as the Mbuti, Aka, and Baka have faced eviction from the Congo Basin under the guise of national parks or logging concessions, despite generations of sustainable forest stewardship. Their knowledge of flora, fauna, and climate adaptation is systematically ignored. Colonial languages also dominate African multilateral spaces. The African Union, AU, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, the Southern African Development Community, SADC, the East African Community, EAC, and other regional organizations conduct most formal business in English, French, Portuguese, or Arabic. Indigenous African languages rarely appear in meetings, official documents, or legal frameworks. This entrenches historical hierarchies, as decision-making, diplomacy, and access to Pan-African institutions remain largely accessible only to those fluent in colonial tongues. Power over the continent's future is exercised in the languages of former colonizers. Africa remains one of the most linguistically rich continents on Earth, and one of the most linguistically endangered. Hundreds of indigenous African languages face extinction not because their peoples vanished, but because power never learned to speak their words. Indigenous identity is tolerated only when it remains politically quiet. The moment land, minerals, water, or strategic territory are involved, tolerance ends. Asia. Recognition delayed, culture fading. In Asia, indigenous and minority erasure often hides behind claims of homogeneity, nationalism, or historical continuity. States assert ancient cultural narratives while denying or suppressing the existence of first peoples and minority communities within their borders. Japan. The Ainu were denied recognition for generations. Assimilation policies erased language, names, and livelihoods. Only recently acknowledged as indigenous, their language is nearly extinct, kept alive more by documentation than daily use. Traditional knowledge of fishing, hunting, and forest management survives only in small communities. South and Southeast Asia. Indigenous and tribal peoples are displaced by dams, plantations, mining, and militarized zones. Development arrives with contracts and soldiers. Displacement follows without consent. Entire villages are relocated, sacred sites submerged or destroyed, communal lands fenced off for resource extraction. Language decline is tied to schools, courts, and markets that punish indigenous tongue use. Children grow up speaking dominant state languages, while ancestral words survive only in homes or oral histories. In India, Adivasi groups experience land grabs under development projects, with traditional governance overridden by bureaucratic structures. In Indonesia and Malaysia, forest peoples face eviction for palm oil plantations, logging, and protected areas enforced without consultation. In Siberia, indigenous reindeer herding communities are pressured to conform to state-led industrial projects and schooling policies, eroding language and seasonal knowledge. In the Middle East, also known as West Asia, we have Palestinians and Kurds. First, let's see Palestinians. Displacement as structure. Palestinians today live across historic Palestine, Israel, and neighboring countries as refugees, following one of the most extensive demographic disruptions of the modern era. In 1948, approximately 750,000 Palestinians, nearly 58% of the population at the time, were forcibly displaced. Since then, repeated wars, land confiscation, settlement expansion, and prolonged military occupation have produced a population defined not by natural decline, but by enforced fragmentation. More than 7 million Palestinians now live as refugees or internally displaced persons. Traditional governance systems have been dismantled. Movement is tightly restricted. Villages are demolished, ancestral lands annexed, and cultural expression increasingly criminalized. Language, memory, and community survive under pressure, mediated by permits, checkpoints, and uneven international recognition. Survival is not denied outright, but regulated, delayed, and constrained. Next is Kurds, a nation without a state. Kurds, numbering an estimated 30 to 35 million people, are spread across Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, forming the largest stateless nation in the world. Across these states, Kurdish identity has been systematically constrained. For decades, the Kurdish language was banned or heavily restricted in schools, courts, and public life, most notably in Turkey until the early 2000s, and still limited in practice across the region. Political organizations, civil society groups, and media are frequently criminalized under security laws. Cultural expression is treated not as heritage, but as threat. In Turkey, thousands of Kurdish villages were depopulated during counterinsurgency campaigns in the 1990s. Place names were replaced, festivals restricted, media silenced. In Syria and Iraq, prolonged conflict and military interventions have displaced hundreds of thousands, fragmenting communities and eroding local governance, systems rooted in customary law and communal councils. Kurdish identity survives, spoken carefully, organized defensively, and governed in spaces the state does not fully allow. And there are other marginalized peoples across Asia. Rohingya in Myanmar, subject to statelessness, forced displacement and cultural erasure. Villages burned, schools destroyed, religious practices restricted, and language transmission disrupted. Survival depends on refugee status and international aid rather than local recognition. Tibetans in China. Autonomous governance structures have been curtailed, religious practices monitored, language restricted in schools, and lands appropriated for development or tourism projects. Cultural knowledge tied to monastic and rural life is increasingly fragmented. Assyrians, Yazidis, and other minorities in Iraq and Syria, displaced by conflict, targeted by extremist groups, or restricted under state centralization. Languages, traditions, and governance systems are preserved only in diaspora or fragmented communities. Across Asia, identity survives in private while disappearing in public. Modern states often tolerate indigenous culture as heritage. They resist it as authority. Language, land, and governance remain tightly controlled by bureaucracies that see indigenous systems as outdated or obstructive. Cultural survival is contingent, fragile, and heavily mediated by outside recognition, rather than being an inherent right. When survival is constrained by conflict, occupation, or legal marginalization, generations inherit not thriving culture, but fragmented memory. Europe. Silent erasure and language hierarchies. Europe, often portrayed as a bastion of modernity and rule of law, exhibits parallel patterns of indigenous and minority marginalization, though in less globally visible ways. Sami communities in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia face land restrictions, resource extraction, and cultural assimilation, despite international recognition of their rights. Traditional reindeer herding is regulated by state authorities, often privileging economic development over indigenous practices. Minority languages such as Breton, Basque, Occitan, Welsh, Gaelic, and Romani have long been sidelined in public life. Schools, courts, and administrations primarily operate in dominant state languages, effectively excluding indigenous and minority communities from full participation in civic life. EU institutions, including the European Commission and Council of Europe, operate almost exclusively in a handful of official languages: English, French, and German, making cross-border advocacy for indigenous rights. Dependent on fluency in dominant languages, legal recognition often exists on paper but is undermined by bureaucratic obstacles and limited enforcement. Cultural survival becomes contingent on political quietness, mirroring patterns in Africa. Language hierarchies, land expropriation, and economic pressures continue to shape whose identity is considered legitimate within the state. Europe's model shows that structural erasure is not confined to post-colonial contexts. It is embedded in modern governance systems, masked as environmental management, national unity, or administrative efficiency. Why this is happening? The pattern is global and consistent. It repeats across continents, regimes, and ideologies. Land taken in the name of development. Languages erased in the name of unity. Customary law dismantled in the name of progress. Resistance punished in the name of security. Extraction is framed as growth. Displacement is renamed relocation. Silence is rewarded as loyalty. This is not failure. It is not accident. It is a system working as designed, one that concentrates power upward, simplifies identity downward, and treats diversity as inefficiency. A system that values territory over people, profit over continuity, and control over consent. When indigenous nations assert land rights, they are labeled obstacles. When they defend rivers and forests, they are called anti-development. When they insist on self-rule, they are treated as threats to the state. The logic is simple. Survival becomes negotiable when it interferes with power. Closing. What survival really means. Indigenous nations are not asking to be preserved like museum pieces. They are not asking to be remembered after they are gone. They are asking to live on their land, in their languages, under their own laws, with the right to shape their future. International law recognizes this right. Treaties exist. Declarations are signed. Judgments are issued. Reality often denies it. Survival is delayed through bureaucracy. Rights are acknowledged without being enforced. Justice is promised without being delivered. The disappearance of indigenous nations is not inevitable. It is not natural. It is a political choice, made through policies, budgets, borders, and silence. And so is their survival. The question is not whether indigenous peoples can endure. They already have. The question is whether the modern world will allow them to. That brings us to the end of today's edition of Digital Oromia. What are your thoughts on the issues discussed? From which part of the world are you watching? And which indigenous peoples are facing challenges in your country today? Share your reflections in the comments. Thank you for watching.